Hello, I'm Simone Howard, and we were reading The Twits. The last chapter we had talked about was Mrs. Twit shrinking. Now, before that, Mr. Twit had been able to convince Mrs. Twit that she was shrinking by adding a tiny bit, gradually increasing the height of her cane. And so he was able to convince her that she was shrinking because the cane that she used for years was suddenly too big for her. And then to really convince her, he made all the legs on her favorite chair taller also to make Mrs. Twit convinced that she is shrinking. And so she has done something very silly. She has told her husband, who she put her eyeball into his drink, and she fed him wormy spaghetti. She has told him that she is willing to do anything she can to keep from shrinking down into nothingness, from getting the dreadful shrinks. Now, this man has taken and put a frog in her bed and scared her half to death by telling her it was something called a giant skilly wiggler. And he has also, well, I think this is the next trick. That's it. And so he has convinced her that she has the shrinks, and she is terribly scared. If you remember in the last chapter, she was drooling. She was drooling and shivering at the same time because she's so scared. And so we're about to read the chapter called, let me get to it. Nope. Still looking. The chapter called Mrs. Twit Gets a Stretching. Now, as discussed last time, stretching, we don't quite know what Mr. Twit knows about that, but I know in my head that whenever I think of stretching, I think of a piece of Laffy Taffy, and you could pull at both ends and it gets longer, or think of a piece of already chewed gum, take it out of your mouth and you could pull it and it gets longer. Or whenever you wake up in the morning and you're real tired, and you stretch. That's stretching. And so we're going to find out what Mr. Twit is talking about with stretching. We know already that his wife is very scared and that he has no mercy on her. He doesn't feel sorry for her at all. He had to eat worms, which is understandable. So let's begin reading. Mrs. Twit Gets a Stretching. Mr. Twit led Mrs. Twit outdoors where he had everything ready for the great stretching. He had 100 balloons and lots of string. He had a gas cylinder for filling the balloons. So these aren't just going to be air-filled balloons. These are actually going to be inflated balloons that can rise into the air. And he has 100 of them, which is a lot. He has fixed an iron ring into the ground. Now, we're going to stop here because I'm not sure if you know what that means. Now, I want you to imagine a circle that's made out of iron, and it has a little end on it and attached to the ground. Now, this is like a picture hanger. You can use this to hang up pictures on the wall. But this is what I think Roald Dahl was talking about whenever he was talking about an iron ring affixed to the ground. I think something huge like this was put into the ground, and he's going to, well, let's see what he does with that. Stand here, he said, pointing to the iron ring. And then he tied Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. When he was done, he began filling the balloons with gas. Each balloon was on a long string when it was filled with gas. It pulled up on its string, trying to go up and up. Mr. Twit tied the ends of the string to the top half of Mrs. Twit's body. Some he tied around her neck, and some he tied under her arms, and some to her wrists, and even to her hair. Soon there were 50 colored balloons floating in the air above Mrs. Twit's head. Can you feel them stretching you? Asked Mr. Twit. I can, cried Mrs. Twit. They're stretching me like mad. He put on another 10 balloons. An upward pull became very strong. Mrs. Twit was quite helpless. With her feet tied to the ground and her arms pulled upward by the balloons, she was unable to move. She was a prisoner, and Mr. Twit had intended to go away and leave her like that for a couple of days and nights to teach her a lesson. In fact, he was just about to leave when Mrs. Twit opened her big mouth and said something silly. And that ends that chapter. I didn't show you any pictures this time because it is a pictureless chapter. Anyways, so I wanted to talk to you about a couple words in here. There's the word helpless. Mrs. Twit was helpless when the balloons lifted her up in the air. Now, okay, let me see if you can see this. I wrote in light blue like a silly person. Helpless. Less is a suffix that means without. So Mrs. Twit is without help when tied up with the 100 balloons. So she's helpless. Like hopeless would mean you're without hope. Instead, Mrs. Twit is helpless. She might also be hopeless, but that hasn't come up yet. Okay, so, and the next word I want to talk to you about was unable. You can hear the prefix un in it, and un means not. So Mrs. Twit is not able to move herself, is not able to move herself when she is attached to the balloon. So he has made it where she is completely helpless, without help, and unable, not able to move. Anytime you see the word less in a word, you got to understand that this word before, whatever the root is, means without attached to it. And then un means not. So unable, not able. Like unhappy means not happy. And those are a little bit of information on our roots, prefixes, affixes. We're going to go on to the next chapter and we're going to find out what Mrs. Twit said. What Mrs. Twit said that makes Mr. Twit stop leaving. In fact, he was just about to leave when Mrs. Twit opened her big mouth and said something silly.